Two and a Half Admins, episode 186. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. Roku disables players and TVs with attempt to coerce arbitration agreement. This is pretty bad of Roku and really puts me off wanting to buy one.
Yeah, it really puts me off of the several of them that I already own, for that matter. Unfortunately, it's a little late for that. Roku has always had an arbitration clause, but they are one of several companies that has seen an increase in folks finding a way to punish companies for not responding rapidly enough to massive numbers of incoming arbitration cases, that they want to rejigger their arbitration requirements so that they won't get hit with too many arbitration suits in a row that they don't want to pay for. And they don't want to give you any choice about it. Just, nope, we decided we're changing all the rules and click here, and your clicking here says that you're totally cool with this. Your only other option is to immediately unplug the thing and throw it in the garbage.
Yeah, because if you don't click OK, then you can't even use the thing.
Yeah, because it's a modal dialogue. There's no way to get around it.
As with almost every device like this, usage of the device is dependent on you accepting the terms of service. So if they update the terms of service, you get this pop-up, and until you agree, you can't continue to use the device. It's kind of a problem with the way we've seen these terms of services get abused, and, you know, the fact that people generally don't read them. But Roku kind of did the right thing here of highlighting the part that was of interest, but it just means that unless you agree to give all your rights away, you can't use this device. Now, technically that happens with all the devices, and you had already agreed to Roku's previous terms to start using the device in the first place, but killing the device in the middle of you using it basically is a new kind of low. It's like, if this happens when you first bought the device, you maybe have the option to return the device. But if you've had your Roku for 2 years and then suddenly it's decided, oh, we're changing the rules on you, and if you don't accept them, your Roku is a paperweight now, then you're kind of stuck in a situation of either I hit accept or I don't use a Roku anymore.
Can we just pretend that someone out there might not know exactly what arbitration means in this context?
Sure, we can pretend that. Arbitration means we don't want to risk going in front of a real judge and jury, so we're going to contract with a third-party firm who plays like they're judges and let them decide the issues of any case that comes up. The other thing I want to point out about this is that I find the whole, like, you must click here to agree to these terms of service thing pretty misleading as well as sketchy, because most people think that, you know, oh, well, this means that I have to do this incredibly binding thing. Now, American courts have long since ruled that no, like a click here thing doesn't really commit you to a whole hell of a lot. So you can basically still argue all these things in a court of law if you would like to. Now, in this case, it's going to be difficult because we're only talking about going from one type of arbitration to another type of arbitration, and you much more credibly agreed to the original terms of service, so presumably you're okay with arbitration. So it gets kind of hazy that way. But I wish more people were aware that these incredibly voluminous terms of service, when you just click OK, it is not the same thing as putting your social security number and your full legal name and signing your legal signature on a document.
Yeah, but also that maybe terms of service is so long you can't, like, it would be impractical to try to read it on your TV like they're doing here. It's just not the best way to run our lives. Like, everything has such long terms of service, and we've seen the shenanigans where, like, oh, they make you scroll all the way to the bottom before you didn't read it and click I agree anyway. And all these token efforts.
It's always just kabuki. I mean, none of that actually makes those things any more enforceable in court. It does not do the company any freaking good to say, oh, but they had to scroll all the way to the bottom before they clicked. Like, a judge is not going to care. A jury is more going to be pissed off than anything else. What it does is it helps increase the chilling effect of those big, nasty terms of service anyway. It gives the company a way to tell you when you start getting angry before it gets to a court phase, well, we have a record of you agreeing to these terms of service, and in fact, we can see that you scrolled all the way to the bottom, signifying that you read the whole thing before you agreed. Now, everybody's lying. They don't think you read the whole thing. You know you didn't read the whole thing, and they know perfectly well that's going to have no bearing in court, but that's not going to stop them from trying to use it as a club to beat you over the head with. And if you don't know any better, well, enjoy your concussion, I guess, if we're going to continue the metaphor.
Why does Apple make you click twice, I wonder? It makes you click once at the bottom and then there's a pop-up as well.
Click different. And also, I would like to return to an earlier thing that we just kind of said and glossed over, which was that, it's impractical to read these long terms of service on a television screen. Don't get me wrong, I'm not pushing back because you're wrong. I'm pushing back because there's too many words in that sentence. These terms of service are effectively too long for anybody to reasonably be expected to read as a consumer. I personally read more of the fine print than any other human I have ever met on this planet in the last 52 years. I always make jokes when people get irritated about, waiting for me to scroll through and leaf through something I'm about to sign. I make a joke, hey, the last time I signed a document without reading it, I ended up in the Navy. I'm never going to do that again. And it makes them laugh enough that they'll get off my back while I finish at least skimming the terms. Mm-hmm. But the terms keep getting longer and longer. And, whereas in the late 90s, you might have to read through maybe 6 on-screen pages of terms of service and be like, oh my God, I can't believe how long in Byzantine this is. It's going to be more like a novella half the time today.
Mm-hmm.
And are you really going to read that for every single device and service in your life?
Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous, honestly.
What these increasingly long terms of service actually represent are large corporations using their leverage to beat you down as somebody who individually has far less resources than they do.
Well, it actually gets worse for Roku because they recently had a data breach where at least 15,000 customer accounts were hacked, for want of a better word. And it looks like that was credential stuffing because they don't offer two-factor authentication.
Well, to some degree, it's like, do I want two-factor authentication on my phone or on my TV, where I have to go and find my phone to log in to watch Netflix or whatever? But at the same time, yeah, if I'm putting my credit card in and buying things, maybe, in fact, I would prefer to have 2FA.
Exactly. I mean, what we're talking about here really are the credentials to your Roku account specifically. And I got news for you. You don't need to log in to the account management parts of your Roku account to use your Roku. That's not usually something that you do even on the Roku. And I say this as somebody who I've literally lost count at this point of how many Roku devices I own. Bare minimum 3, the one upstairs, the one downstairs, and my travel Roku that I keep ready to go for family vacations. But when I do things that require logging into my Roku account, like adding a new channel that I'm paying for via my Roku subscription, which frankly is a thing that I just don't do anymore because it rarely works very well and tends to cause you problems down the road with the original channel that you're subscribing to. But when and if I do that kind of thing, I'm not doing it on the Roku. I'm doing it on my PC.
Yeah, although I see the customer experience sometimes the other way. Like my parents each have a Roku and they don't really use a computer most days. And so it would be weird for them to think to go on their computer to log in and change something about their TV. But the fact that this was only 15,000 accounts really suggests it wasn't so much that Roku got hacked as, like they were saying, credential stuffing. 15,000 people use the same password for their Roku account that they used for some other thing that got hacked. And somebody's like, well, we can go into all these Rokus and get credit card numbers and so on and use it to buy gift cards or whatever to then pilfer real products.
Stop reusing passwords, people. This is what it leads to.
Every time.
Charges against journalist Tim Burke are a hack job. This is an op-ed piece for Ars Technica.
And in my opinion, this is a really interesting op-ed piece because it's hard to figure out whose side you're on. And there's no, in my opinion, real clear, easy answer for the rights and the wrongs of it, which is not something that we see that often these days. Usually it's real obvious who is a horrible villain. But in this case, Tim Burke is a journalist who, he is the one who first pushed out deleted footage from a Tucker Carlson interview of Kanye West, a.k.a. Yeezy, or, whatever he's going by this week. As we all know these days, Yee has had some, I don't want to get sued, but let's just say he's been a bit mentally erratic in public, and he said a lot of anti-Semitic and just plain jaw-droppingly strange and offensive things.
Stupid, at the very least, let's say.
Yeah, I don't think anybody should argue with stupid. But the point is, Tucker Carlson got an interview, and Fox elected not to publish a good bit of the footage in which Kanye was, the most modern Kanye during the interview. Tim Burke found the footage and published it. Now, the issue that Fox is suing him over is that Fox says that he broke into their servers in order to publish it. Now, Burke's story is, well, it's not really breaking in. I didn't break in or hack anything. I found a password on the internet, and I just used the password that had already been dumped on the internet to gain access to this stuff. And it's really easy for a lot of us to go, well, obviously the guy who's exposing how horrible Fox and Kanye are must be the good guy, and we don't want him to go to jail. And the CFAA is a terrible law that we're constantly complaining about because it's so overbroad. So obviously, this is terrible, and poor Tim Burke, and we need to come to his side. In fact, that was the thrust of the op-ed on ours. And you would think that would go over on ours because, again, this is a site where, to the extent folks talk about politics, they very much tend to be pro-progressive. They're not frequently conservative, let alone MAGA. And Ars Technica is a place where nobody likes the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. But in this case, most of the commentariat, myself included, were like, yeah, Burke, you screwed up here, buddy. Because the analogy here to the real world is Burke is saying, well, you're saying that I broke into that house. But, I just used a key that I found under the mat. So that means it's okay. And nah, I don't know about that guy. Yeah, the key was criminally easy to find in terms of whoever was responsible for securing that door should be fired, but that doesn't change the fact that this was clearly a restricted area that you were not supposed to be in, and you used a credential to gain access that you knew perfectly well was not intended for you. So, as much as I'm on Tim Burke's side with a capital S, and I don't like the people that are mad at him, and I don't like the law that's being used to nail him, I don't think Fox is in the wrong here. He broke in.
Wow. It takes quite something for you to say that about Fox, man.
And even just to agree with the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
Yeah.
But it very much comes down to exactly the analogy that Jim made. If it was a locked door, even if the key's right there, they locked the door because they wanted to keep you out. So you knew they wanted you not to be there. And so by going there, that's a violation. It's different than when the CFAA was abused with AT&T had a URL that had no password. If you knew the URL, you could just go there and get a list of every iPhone that was sold or whatever. And they tried to bring that guy up on the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act because he got in there. But it's there was no lock. Right? The door was open, so that's okay. But the act of putting a lock on the door, even if it's a cheap one that's easy to pick or the key is right there or whatever, if the door was locked, that's the sign that you were not intended to be able to just walk in there.
Yeah.
I suppose it's if someone's password is password 123, you can't say, oh, well, they deserved it then. It was fair game. It's still hacking into their account, even if their password was shit.
It depends on the context. I mean, you and I and Alan, just having a conversation, can absolutely say, you deserved it, man. You set your password to password 123 on an internet accessible service. You deserved it. We can say that, and it makes sense. However, in a court of law, if I'm on the jury and, this same guy got his retirement account drained because he had a stupid password on it, and we actually have the culprit there, catching charges, am I going to be no, acquit because his password was easy? Hell no, man. You were still trying to break into an account to steal from somebody or to fraud somebody or whatever. You knew what you were doing, and, it being relatively easy to do doesn't make you not a thief.
Yeah. And some of the other context around this does feel a little bit off, the government's case of, the journalist has to ask permission to use this published information. It's well, the people who I'm trying to expose for hiding this are not really going to give me permission to it. But if it's their content and you had to go somewhere you weren't supposed to go to get it, it turns out to be the case, even if it is kind of ludicrous on its face.
And I mean, really, I don't think this was all that ludicrous. I used the analogy of, looking under a mat to find a key, but it was a little bit better secured than that. It's not like he got the password off of another page on Fox's site. He went digging around and dumped password lists. I mean, that's thief stuff, man.
Well, according to this, he found some radio station had on their website posted the password to go into LiveView, the service that was providing the security for these clips. And they had a demo account. And if you logged in with a demo account, you could just access all the videos, which is a different question. Why is this demo account able to access everybody's videos? There's a whole different security problem on the fault of the live streaming service, but that's really not what's at issue here.
Well, really, I mean, again, this is why the CFAA was made so broad to begin with, because companies think that they shouldn't have to bother with security, and they wanted the CFAA to, make it legal for companies to just say everything that we say is ours, and we don't need anything else. We can just say, oh, that's ours, and you go to jail if you touch it. That's what the CFAA was originally for.
Yeah, it was especially just when the courts and law enforcement couldn't keep up with the pace of technology, and they were just like, well, just make it overly broad so we can use it however we want. We promise not to abuse it.
Which, again, to Joe's and Alan's earlier point, is why it's just so galling that I'm in here coming down on the side of all things, Fox News and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. But I don't see any way around it, Like, I'm not mad at Tim Burke for doing what he did, but I think there comes a point where you have to say either this is worth doing and accepting the consequences, or it isn't. Like, there's a big difference between saying, yeah, I broke the law, and here's why I broke the law, and, breaking the law, and then trying to be like, oh, well, I didn't really. I'm one of the good guys. Don't prosecute me. Like, oh, come on, man.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Kolide. If you work in security or IT and your company has Okta, this message is for you. Have you noticed that for the past few years, the majority of data breaches and hacks you read about have something in common? It's employees. Hackers absolutely love exploiting vulnerable employee devices and credentials, but it doesn't have to be this way. Imagine a world where only secure devices can access your cloud apps. In this world, phished credentials are useless to hackers, and you can manage every OS, even Linux, from a single dashboard. Best of all, you can get employees to fix their own device security issues without creating more work for IT. The good news is, you don't have to imagine this world. You can just start using Kolide. Kolide is a device trust solution for companies with Okta, and it ensures that if a device isn't trusted and secure, it can't log into your cloud apps. So support the show and visit kolide.com/25A to watch a demo and see how it works. That's KOLIDE.com/25A. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an RSS feed with no ads that includes either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And you even get some episodes early. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what Dalton has done. He writes, what are your thoughts on jumbo frames on wired Ethernet and Wi-Fi networks? Every once in a while, I try to juice some throughput by increasing the allowed frame size on my clients and switch ports, but I always know in the back of my head that something is going to break, and I won't notice until a month has passed and I forgot what I changed.
Before we get started on our thoughts on jumbo frames, we should probably make sure everybody's up to speed on what jumbo frames really are. Most of you that listen to this show will probably at least be familiar with the term MTU. You'll have seen it in, IFconfig and Windows network configuration stuff. MTU is short for maximum transmission unit, and basically it's the maximum size of the payload of a packet before that packet needs to be split into multiples. So for Ethernet, your standard MTU is 1500. You can have up to 1500 bytes of payload data in each packet. If you've got 2.5K to transmit, then you're going to need 2 packets. The first will be a full 1500 and the next one will be a short packet. Jumbo frames refer to a much larger MTU. Most frequently, when somebody says jumbo frames, what they really mean is a 9K packet size. Actually, it's not really 9K. That's fun. It's actually 9,000 byte payload. Only then it gets even worse, because in some cases you actually mean 9,000 bytes when you say MTU equals 9,000, for the payload. But in some cases, to get the exact same thing, you need to actually say 9,015, because on some operating systems, they count the payload header as part of the packet size that's counted in the MTU. So you've got a Linux box on one side that you've set MTU 9000, and you've got a Windows box on the other side that you've set, jumbo packets to 9015 in the advanced settings on the interface. And it's a mess. If you don't get everything matching correctly on both sides, you can either end up with absolutely no throughput whatsoever, or you can end up with what looks on the surface to be roughly the same amount of throughput, maybe even a little bit more. Only when you look a little closer with a tool like iPerf3, you discover that you're actually, you're initiating something like, I've seen like 5,000 or 6,000 retries a second from broken packets. So this is a deal where you really, really have to commit to getting it right if you're going to start screwing around with it at all. With that said, when will jumbo frames benefit you? Well, if you're not doing at least 10 gigabit networking, do not play with jumbo frames. There's no point. Now, once you hit 10 gigabit or up, then jumbo frames can be worth it, but it's still going to be depending on your actual, network traffic payload. If you need to move a lot of small packets, for example, maybe you're copying a bunch of teeny tiny files, or you're fulfilling very small database requests, something like that, having jumbo frames on isn't going to help you a bit. On the other hand, if you're moving very, very high throughput payloads, well, like say streaming video, something like that, and you want it to go as rapidly as humanly possible, well, if you set your MTU to 9,000 for jumbo frames instead of the default 1,500, now you're sending a quarter as many packets, a little bit fewer actually, in order to move the same amount of data. So you're talking about less overall payload in terms of packet headers, and you're also talking about less resource exhaustion on all of your network equipment on the way through. That includes the computer on either end, any switches along the way, you name it, because their CPUs have to process fewer packets to move the same amount of data.
Alan, you used to do video streaming. Did you ever use this?
In a couple different ways. So going right back to the beginning, why is there an MTU? And that, especially going back to the earlier days of the internet when connections were very unreliable, there were just noise on the line or packets get dropped or whatever, it was to control how much would have to be retransmitted, right? If we break the long, big data stream into smaller pieces, then if one of them gets corrupted or lost, then the amount we have to retransmit is less. And so that's why you have this concept of an MTU. And then as connections got faster, it didn't make sense to necessarily change the default. And it's why you probably wouldn't want to look at using larger frames on Wi-Fi. I have no experience with doing it on Wi-Fi. I don't even know what the limitations are, but it would probably cause more problems with airtime, especially because if you transmit something and it gets garbled by some other RF interference, then that's that much more that you have to retransmit. If you think about it, even in kind of other terms, the reason why when you used to download stuff off ISOs off the internet, they were in RAR files that were split into smaller chunks. So if one of those got corrupted, they only had to re-upload one chunk, not the whole giant Linux ISO.
In terms of Wi-Fi, you don't do jumbo packets ever on omnidirectional multi-client Wi-Fi. However, when you're doing long-distance stable point-to-point links, very high bandwidth, frequently, yes, you absolutely do use jumbo frames in those circumstances.
Didn't you set that up for your parents or parents-in-law or something, Jim?
Yeah, I did. On a very small scale, I set up a couple of cheap TP-Link devices as, kind of a demo. We ended up not really using it for anything that they cared about there at the barn, but we bridged the distance about, I want to say it was like 60 meters across some wooded terrain with a couple of TP-Link point-to-point devices. But again, in that case, we're only talking about 100 megabit maximum throughput, which was capped not by the Wi-Fi characteristics, but by the 100 megabit wired Ethernet interfaces on either side. So jumbo frames are not something that you would have wanted there. Now, on the other hand, if I had put in, much higher end devices that had, much higher end interfaces on there and were capable of moving 10 gigabits or more of data, and there we are again, then now we would want to look at jumbo frames, and for the same reasons.
Yeah, and one of the other things that's the biggest limitation of jumbo frames, I guess to be pedantic for a minute, when Jim was talking about it earlier, he was talking about shrinking the packets, but it's the frames. So at the Ethernet level, at layer 2 of the OSI stack, the signal going across the physical cable is Ethernet, and it only goes to the other end of that cable. So if you are sending an Ethernet packet, it goes through switches fine, but once it hits a router or another computer, it stops. And if it does get routed or something, it creates a new Ethernet frame that then usually contains the same TCP packet. And so the TCP packets that you're generated by your applications are still up to 64 kilobytes at a time. Just when we break those up and put them in envelopes of Ethernet frames, those are broken down to the 1500 bytes. And so the fact that jumbo frames don't go through a router means that they're only useful on a LAN, except for in one special case. So Joe kind of brought this up. I had an ISP who is providing transit to me, who would accept up to 4,000 byte Ethernet frames. So I could use jumbo frames to stream data to them, and they would carry it across their entire network as 4K jumbo frames and only break it up into 1,500 byte frames when they relayed it off to somebody else, like a peer on the internet. And this allowed both me and them to reduce the CPU usage on the routers at my side and all the way across their network. And then it was only their edge connection where they were then passing it off to a peer where they would have the extra load of breaking up these bigger packets into smaller ones.
Although, as long as we're being pedantic, I'm going to return the favor to Alan and say it's not that jumbo frames are only useful on the LAN, it's that jumbo frames are only useful between directly connected segments.
Yes.
Because I don't think most people would consider the handoff between one major data center and another a LAN,
True.
But you frequently are, in fact, running jumbo packets, across these really big interconnects.
Yep. So what Jim was talking about, the main thing you're saving there is CPU, mostly from the interrupts, right? Every time a network card gets a new packet, it has to say, hey, CPU, I have a packet that needs to be processed. Most NICs now have what's called interrupt moderation, where they won't necessarily do it for every packet, but like every so many milliseconds, when there's at least one new packet, they'll be like, hey, I need attention. And every time that happens, that is extra work the CPU has to do. And so if you can have fewer of those, then you're using less CPU. Plus, like Jim said, breaking it into fewer, larger pieces is less protocol overhead and just less work as you're doing the TCP segmentation, right? If you're going to take a really big piece of data and break it down into 64K TCP packets and then break it down into either 1,500 byte or 9,000 byte Ethernet frames, that's all these steps that have to happen. And the fewer of those steps you do now, the fewer it also has to undo on the other side to turn that back into here's the 1 megabyte message that you actually send over the network.
And if you're not that familiar with this stuff and you're wondering, does it really make that big of a difference? I mean, these guys are talking about CPU this, CPU that, CPU the other, but computers are so powerful these days. Well, let me introduce to you a couple of quick facts. One is that router performance is not measured by professionals generally in throughput. It's measured in packets per second for very good reason. A typical router is more than capable of saturating line level on the actual media connected to it, but it will not be capable of managing that maximum throughput with small packets. That's why they're measured in packets per second. Now, the other thing that I would like to point out that may make the light bulb go off for a lot of people is every packet has to get processed by every rule on your firewall. That might not mean much at home, but when you're talking about moving packets through a heavy corporate firewall that may have pages on pages of rules to move through, or it decides what it's doing with every individual packet, cutting the number of packets it's doing that to for the same workload matters.
Yep. And another place where I've seen it be very effective is if you're doing iSCSI over your network or any kind of storage. If you're transmitting entire disk sectors at a time over the network, and there's, say, 4 kilobytes, if your jumbo frame size means you can transmit the whole 4 kilobyte sector as one Ethernet frame instead of breaking it up into 1,500 bytes at a time, it can really improve the responsiveness of the network. But as Dalton pointed out in his original question, the problem is the switch has to be configured for jumbo frames on all these ports. And once the switch allows a jumbo frame to go out of port, if a client's not configured for jumbo frames and will just reject it, it's as if the packet wasn't sent, and you get all these problems.
That is frequently not the case anymore. All of the 10 gig switches that I am personally using, TP-Link Jetstream switches, they actually have auto detect for jumbo frames. There's literally nothing to configure.
Yeah. But if you're also familiar with the concept of path MTU discovery on the internet, dating back especially to where, DSL lines often had the MTU set to not 1500, but something like 1492, because you had to have the DSL encapsulation go on the outside of your frame, and then it had to still fit across a 1500 byte Ethernet thing. And you can still see the same thing with VPNs, or especially if you have a VPN within a VPN. Sometimes you'll get much better performance by setting a lower MTU so that your whole message will remain as one message instead of getting split into two as it transitions the multiple layers of VPN you might have to go through to access something for work or whatever. And that can end up making a big difference on the performance.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Mastodon.social.
We'll see you next week.